All right. Welcome to this episode of The Good Girls Club. We are officially made it to the Smut Hut. If you are, if you haven't watched the VOD, just know I said and did nothing, and that the Boo Coven are lying slanderers, okay? Anywho, so shut up, Chris. This is gonna be in the VOD, Chris. So welcome in. So, welcome to this episode of The Good Girls Club. Tonight in the Poop Coven, it has been a very, very, very smutty Saturday. We will not talk about light bulbs in here ever again. But let's be serious. So, big 180 energy vibes. We are going to be reading Manacled. Manacled is a Draco and Hermione fan fiction. It is a dark romance surrounding Draco and Hermione, and the trigger warnings are substantial. Sorry, I'm reading chat. I shouldn't be laughing about that. The trigger warnings are substantial, so I will read them to you. The warnings are rape, mutilation, forced marriage, degradation, forced breeding, death, war, and suicide. So viewer discretion is advised. And please stop bringing up light bulbs. So welcome in, everybody. Again, we are reading Manacled. Wow, we're really struggling on this episode. Okay, we are going to be reading chapters 29, 30, and 31 today. I'm going to do a little summary about what's been going on in the house of the Manacled Lord. I really needed more time to recover, guys. Okay, so where are we in this world? All right, so we are volume 1 is complete. We are now finally into volume 2. In volume 1, we find that our Hermione has been in isolation and sensory deprivation at the bottom of Hogwarts in a dungeon, after we find out that the good guys essentially lost the war and Voldemort and all the Death Eaters have taken over. We find out that during her time, she had manacles on her wrist that absorbed any type of magic. So she turned the magic inward, and she protected her own memories using occlumency, creating almost like little pearls in her brain, hardened, magical little balls that legamins, or using legamency, they can't infiltrate and get to those memories. Hermione, amongst other witches, is put into a breeding program that's really just a ruse that Voldemort's doing to disguise that his health is declining, as Horcruxes are still somehow being taken out, and they don't know by who. And Hermione is part of this breeding program, and she is brainwashed by Professor Umbridge to be compliant, to be easy, and she's given to the High Reeve. We find out the High Reeve is Draco Malfoy. At Malfoy Manor, Hermione endures long-lasting PTSD from her time in sensory deprivation. She's attacked by Montague, who tries to rape her, and he, gets gutted literally by Draco. Draco also, by gutting Montague in such a public display, also outed himself as the High Reeve, which he had kept private and quiet up until this point. Hermione also, her eyes almost gouged out by Draco's wife, even though Draco has no interest in his wife whatsoever, Astoria. And then unfortunately all this culminates to Hermione does get pregnant by Draco, even though every single time they're forced to copulate, he's disgusted, he retches, he runs out of the room. He does get her pregnant. And then that pregnancy, they talk about how, because her memories are locked away, they're hoping that the pregnancy will bust open all of her memories, and that's exactly what it does. So in volume 2, almost all volume 2 is really gonna be flashback. So all these memories that Hermione has kept secret is finally coming to pass. And what so far we found out in volume 2 is Draco, we don't know why, but this is very important. So this is volume 2 now. Draco, during the peak of the war, Harry is still alive. Ron is still alive. The Order is still alive. Hermione is working as the main healer for the Order of Phoenix. Draco, it seems out of nowhere, wants to jump ship and switch sides and become a double agent for the Order. The Order doesn't know why he wants to do this. All of a sudden he wants to do this, but it seems to be good. Snape even verifies, Snape, who's been a double agent this whole time, that this is a good offer and this could change the tide of war. But his only stipulation, his only thing is that he wants Hermione during and after the war. Like, she is claimed. His. That's all he wants. She doesn't know why. They are going to meet in a private, completely secretive location. And during their first meeting, they really, Hermione at this point is strong and emotionally incredibly resilient. We see all the trauma that being a healer has so far caused her, the rift it's caused between her and all the other Order members, and how she really is isolated and alone. And then we see her first interaction with Draco, where she knows, she's Hermione, right? Full intact Hermione. And we see she goes toe-to-toe with him. She doesn't back down. He tries to bait her, like, oh yeah, give me a kiss, thinking that she would never do that. And to his utter shock, she leans in and she kisses him, which she's horrified by. And he jumps back and he's like, wow, I didn't think you would do that. And then take it a step further, he also gives her a ring. They each wear a black band on their pointer finger, and anytime the other one needs the other one, they can tap the ring and it will slightly burn, like a little bit, just to warn them that they need to meet in this secret location. And really, while she's there also, Draco starts giving her immediately pivotal information. He tells her, he invades her mind, but he does so with a purpose. He's like, if anybody in my side of the war, in the Death Eaters camp, invades your mind and sees that I am meeting with you, our whole cover's blown. So he starts immediately giving her advice on how to be an Occlumens, how to protect her memories. He also immediately drops and gives them very pivotal war strategy maps, and he gives them to Hermione as well. So we already know that this first meeting with Draco and Hermione is very fraught with energy. Hermione's very unsure about what he wants from her. Of course, in Hermione fashion, she does a ton of research to try to figure it out. But he is already very taken aback by her, and he doesn't really know what to make of her. And their dynamic is very complex. So we're gonna now proceed with chapter 29. Again, this is going to be Flashback City for a while. And reminder to any of our VOD listeners or to any of our poops in the chat right now or poops in the Discord, if you ever have any questions specifically that you want, you could always put them in chat. You could always put them in the book horror section in Discord or on the comments on the YouTube video. And if I missed your question, like DM them to me personally and I'll still try to get to your question if you ever have any questions. So, chapter 29. If you're ready to begin, we're at chapter 29, flashback number 4. April 2002. The next time she arrived at the shack, she had barely gotten through the door before Malfoy abruptly apparated in, nearly on top of her. He grabbed her firmly and backed her up against the wall as his lips crashed into hers. Hermione barely had time to think or react. Her eyes widened in astonishment as they did. His eyes met hers, and he abruptly invaded her mind. She had been so startled, her occlumency walls had fallen. The terrifying distraction of his body pressed against hers while he kissed her made it difficult to focus solely on the sensation of his mind tearing its way through her consciousness. He skimmed through her recent memories, brewing an invisibility potion for the ring he'd given her. Taking Lee Jordan and dropping him at St. Mungo's, he found her memory of their previous meeting. She could feel him experiencing it, even while she was also keenly aware of his lips moving away from hers and kissing along her jaw, while his hands slid along her body. He started moving toward the memory of her conversation with Snape. No, she didn't want him to see that one. Even though she was confident he would know what she was trying to do, she didn't want him to have confirmation of it. She forced herself not to pull the memory away or hide it. Instead, she grabbed onto the first thing she could think of and jerked it forcefully back further into her memories. Malfoy had to have known it was a fate, but he gamely chased after it. After keeping it away from him for a few seconds, she let him catch it. Third year, Malfoy stood in front of her, sneering. "Have you ever seen anything quite as pathetic?" said Malfoy. "And he's supposed to be our teacher." Harry and Ron moved angrily towards him, but Hermione was the quickest. Smack! She slapped Malfoy across the face with all the strength she could muster. Her hand felt aflame from the force, and his pale skin immediately bloomed scarlet where she struck him. He staggered, looking at her with a mixture of pain and astonishment. "Don't you dare call Hagrid pathetic, you foul evil!" she roared. Malfoy abruptly jerked out of her mind and stepped away, shaking. Hermione stared at him, expecting him to be enraged that she tricked him with that memory. Then she realized after a moment that he was laughing. That felt more terrifying. "Well done," he said, still chuckling after a minute. "I expected it would take you longer before you'd be able to do it." Hermione was slumped against the wall, trying to recover herself from his combined mental and physical assault. A migraine was already steadily beginning to creep up on her. "Is this the way you usually teach occlumency?" she said after a moment. His lips quirked faintly. "Only with you," he said with a thin smile. "I can't have you doubting my sincerity now, can I? I need to do something to catch you off guard. So," he shrugged, "2 gnomes, 1 Kniezel. I'm sure you didn't expect me to keep my hands entirely to myself." Hermione fought back the urge to sneer at him. "Should I wear stocking next time I come?" she asked, her voice caustic. His eyes seemed to darken. "No, I rather like you like this. Being dirty and bedraggled in muggle clothing suits you, and I intend to savor you. You needn't start wearing them. Yet." Hermione felt a shiver go through her, of fear, but also from the tension between them. A strain of animosity and calculation filled the air. He stepped closer to her and caught hold of her left hand, lifting it as he slid his thumb across the ring that reappeared on her hand when he stared down at it. "How does this work?" "The potion is based on magical principles similar to the Fidelis," she said, slipping her hand free. "It's only visible if you know to look for it. Otherwise, it's undetectable. Only you and I can see it." Malfoy quirked an approving eyebrow. "I don't believe I've heard of that potion." "It's new," she said stiffly. "Yours?" Hermione gave a reluctant nod. "It's not actually that useful. It only works on metals." "Interesting," he murmured, stepping closer. Every time he drew near, she felt a renewed awareness of how dangerous he was. The dark magic came off of him in waves. It clung to his clothes and his hair and almost emanated from his skin. It was as though he wore a cloak of darkness and rage that he simply was keeping in check around her. There was so much darkness, all the deaths he was responsible for. He was drenched in them. "Let's try again and see how long you could keep it up." His lips pulled into a brief smirk. "I won't kiss you this time." He drove into her mind again. She kept him out with her walls for a minute while she organized her mind and memories. Then she pretended to have the shield give way. She wasn't sure she was actually good at it, or if he was having the decency to restrict himself from rifling through her memories. He allowed her strong attempts at distracting him to succeed. After she'd successfully done it a dozen times, he withdrew. Hermione felt as though her head were about to crack open, as though the pain were a form of pressure that threatened to break through her skull. The pain was agonizing. Her eyes were welling up with tears, and she bit down on her lip to try to keep from crying. "Drink this," he ordered, slipping a vial of pain relief potion into her hand. "Otherwise, you may black out when you try to apparate. I wouldn't recommend it." She swallowed it, fairly certain he wasn't going to poison her. Did that happen to you? She asked when the pain began easing so she could speak again and her vision was no longer littered with flashing black spots. More than once, Malfoy said shortly. My training was rigorous. She nodded. It seemed hard to believe he was the same school bully she had known. Coldness and harshness were built up around him like the walls of a castle. All that scarcely subdued rage. The boy who got boxes of sweets and had a spot bought for him on a Quidditch team, who cried and whined over a scratched arm, he was gone. Everything soft and indolent and pampered about him was carved away by the war. He hadn't bought his way through Voldemort's ranks with galleons. He paid in blood. Everything was so hard and exacting. His smirking and leering and the vagaries of his courtesy all felt like an act, like a mask he was wearing to disguise just how cold he was. If she wanted to succeed, she needed to get past his mask and coldness and rage. He might be intending to use her just as a form of vindictive or amusing stress relief, but she was still determined to become more. She needed to draw out his confidence until she could understand his motivation, until she found a vulnerability she could slip through. No one was pure ice, not even Malfoy. Sorry. There was something about him in his eyes, something that looked like fire hidden deep within. She needed to find a way to reach it and then fuel it into something she could utilize. He expected her to hate him and try to manipulate him with false kindness and sympathy. She had to be clever about it. More clever than him. Was that after 5th year? He looked at her somewhat sharply. Yes, he said in a clipped tone. Your aunt? Mm-hmm. He hummed in confirmation. They were both staring at each other intently. Not the only thing you learned that summer, she said. Are you needing a confession or something, Granger? Should I tell you everything I've done? He drew closer so that he towered above her and sneered down in her face. She forced herself not to shrink or cower back. She stared up into his eyes. Do you want to? She asked. There was the faintest flash of surprise in his expression. He seemed caught off guard by the question. He was lonely. She suspected as much, but now she felt certain. Dead mother, insane father. He was high up in Voldemort's ranks, and they were notoriously filled with backstabbing. If he ever had any regrets, he never told anyone. No, he said, voice sharp, as he stepped away from her. She didn't push. If he thought she were pushing, he'd shut up like a clam. She didn't need to know. She just needed him to realize he wanted to tell someone. That he wanted to tell her. It would make her emotionally valuable to him. It would be a hook, an opening. It would make her interesting. Did you want to go again? She asked after a moment. He stared at her, silver eyes flat. When I was trained, she'd have someone crucio me while she was trying to break into my mind. That's probably what will happen to you if you're ever caught. He didn't give her time to react to the information before he slammed his way in. When he stopped, he didn't wait for her to regain her breath before dropping a new scroll of information next to her and vanishing. That week, Hermione went back to Waterstones. She bought books on the psychological effects of loneliness. Books on orphans, research of psychology of child soldiers. She didn't hesitate as she underlined sections of their vulnerabilities, the ways by which they were prone to being taken advantage of and manipulated. In a notebook upon which she placed a rather nasty security curse, she began to draw up a psychological sketch of Draco Malfoy, what she noticed about him, questions and theories she had, the center of him, his motivation, remained a mysterious blank, but she felt as though she were beginning to get a sense of his edges. The following Tuesday, he did not start by forcing his intentions on her. He set himself to provoking her in other ways. He did not restrain himself at all when he invaded her mind for another round of occlumency training. He scrabbled into the back of it and then meandered through the memories he happened to come across, forcing her to relive some of the deaths she tried hardest not to dwell on. Then, quite by accident, he came across the memory immediately following her conversation with Snape. She flinched when he drew near it, and he immediately pounced. He watched her examine her facial features critically before stepping into the shower, and when she stepped out and appraised her naked body in the mirror, he stopped and stared. Following her mental fault finding, she could feel his condescending amusement as he took her in. She writhed with embarrassment, and he felt that too. He stayed in the memory for far longer than it lasted, and then withdrew entirely from her mind. "Well," he said, looking as though he were about to start laughing, "that certainly is one way to distract your ligaments." She glared up at him. She was sorely tempted to kick him in the groin and then try to stomp his teeth out. "Pleased with your purchase?" Her tone was corrosive. He gave a short laugh under his breath. You're rather scrawny. If you'd sent me the memory beforehand, I might have asked for someone else," he said as he stepped back to look her over in person. "A pity for us both, then," she said, her mouth twisting as she folded her arms defensively. "Perhaps. But then again, if I hadn't gotten you, I would never have had a chance to encounter a brain organized like a filing cabinet." His voice was light and casual, but his quicksilver eyes abruptly hardened. He cocked his head slightly to the side. "Moody didn't train you. You're a natural occlumens." Hermione nodded resignedly. She had assumed he'd realize it eventually. When she'd invented the lie, she hadn't expected him to spend so much time poking around in her head. "Self-taught, then?" "I had a book," she said stiffly. He gave a barking laugh. "Of course." He was staring at her with an expression she couldn't place, as though he were reassessing her. The realization seemed to be making him to reevaluate something about her. Hermione didn't want him to reevaluate. If he did, he might decide to change his strategy. She liked the current way in which she was not having sex with him. "What?" she snapped at him impatiently, hoping to break his train of thought. It seemed to work. The narrowed expression of his eyes eased slightly. "Nothing," he waved her off. "I've just never encountered one before," he smirked. She stared at him with her own eyes narrowed. "You're one too?" she said with rising horror. She was trying to slip past the defenses of someone who could also shudder and isolate their emotions and desires. He gave a mocking bow. "What are the odds?" he mused with a faint shrug. There was a long silence. They were both reevaluating. "Are you still going to teach me occlumency then?" she asked at length. "Yes," he said slowly. "It would be an oversight to only do it halfway. You'll be able to learn quicker than I had expected." "Right," she nodded and braced herself. He drew closer to her. Her heart stuttered. The movement reminded her of an animal stalking prey. Slow, subtle, gradual, and then suddenly, too close. She stared at his face. She wouldn't focus on the physicality of him, on how easily he could break her with his bare hands. His fingers came up and touched her chin lightly, tilting her head further back so that her throat felt bared. "You are so full of surprises," he said, his gaze dragging across her face before locking on her eyes. Hermione rolled her eyes briefly. "Do you say that to every girl?" she said in a sarcastically sweet tone. She didn't bother with the outer walls as he dived into her consciousness. It was the process of having them breach that made her head ache the most. She already felt reasonably confident in her ability to feign that they were easily cracked. He didn't make the invasion painful, which startled her. She'd assumed that legamency was inherently painful. Instead, it felt like her mind was a pensive he was simply dropping into. Her consciousness and his merged. He seemed to be taking in her natural mental state. Without the pain of the Legamency attack, Hermione was able to be more nuanced and intentional in her strategy. She shuffled her memories with the false carelessness, drawing his attention, and then slipping certain ones off into further corners of her mind. It was like learning to dance, or perhaps learning martial arts. All the movement was done slowly, without force. He gave her time to learn the technique, feel what it was like to do properly, going over the forms, drilling it again and again until she could do it instinctively without even needing to think. At length, he withdrew and glanced down at his wrist. "We've gone overtime." "Oh," she said quietly, still mentally preoccupied by the technique she'd been trying to get right. He stared down at her until she straightened and looked up at him. "Do you have any information for this week?" "Not really. There are more vampires arriving from Romania this month. No specific details yet." "If..." Hermione hesitated. He quirked an eyebrow at her, staring down and waiting. "If we needed something, would you be able to get it for us?" she asked. "It would depend on what it is." "A book," he snorted. "It's called Secrets of the Darkest Arts. I've tried everything I can to find it, but the Order's resources are limited." "I'll see what I can do." He gave an irritated sigh. "Be careful," she found herself saying. He looked surprised. "You won't want Voldemort to know you're looking for it." "How important is this book?" he asked with narrowed eyes. "I don't know. It might be nothing, or it might be very important. But don't blow your cover for it." He rolled his eyes. "As if I would," he muttered before eyeing her sharply. "You should go. I'm sure Potter will be pining for you." Hermione gathered up her satchel of potion ingredients and slipped out of the shack. Malfoy was staring after her contemplatively as she closed the door and apparated away. When she got back to Grimmauld Place, she was pensive as she bottled and prepped ingredients. Malfoy was not what she had expected. He was far less cruel than she had anticipated. She kept expecting his malice to suddenly cut through his facade, but either way, he was less malicious than she thought, or he wanted something more complex and nuanced from her interactions with him. She already felt almost certain he didn't have any particular inclination towards hurting her. She couldn't place what he wanted. Severus had been right. Malfoy was already proving to be an excellent spy. All the information he'd given Moody had been high quality and useful. The Order had successfully raided a prison and gotten more than 50 people out. However, his motive remained a mystery. She couldn't understand what he could possibly get from spying. With his placement in Voldemort's army, he'd surely reap vast rewards with the Order's demise. If the Order won, even with a pardon, he'd undoubtedly become a pariah in the wizarding world for the rest of his life. Spies and traitors earned little respect, no matter how vital their contributions were. Besides, Lucius Malfoy was a devoted follower of Voldemort. He blamed Narcissa's death on Ron and Harry and directed almost all of his energy to exacting revenge on them. While Draco might not share that sentiment, setting himself at odds with his father felt dubious. He'd modeled himself so carefully after his sire back in school and had been incensed by his father's imprisonment in Azkaban at the end of 5th year. Hermione laid out a tray full of dittany and cast a heat charm with the tip of her wand, massaging her temple slightly with her other hand as she watched the leaves steadily dry. Malfoy was not interested in her. Not physically. At least no more than a man tended to be interested in any random woman. She'd studied the physiology of sexual attraction, and he showed almost none of the signs. Even after spending several minutes staring baldly at her naked reflection, she flushed. The experience ranked unequivocally as the most embarrassing moment of her life. So what was it all about? Why the kissing and groping? If it was all to provoke and anger her, the question is still why? Why did he want to provoke her? What was driving the various tactics he was employing? Initially, he had clearly expected her to be so filled with hatred for him that she couldn't restrain it. Then, when he'd aggressively snogged her to break through her occlumency shields, he seemed to think he could use it to get her too consumed by emotions to think clearly. The way he'd appraised her in the mirror had also been clearly intended to sting. He wanted her to hate him. But when he realized she was an occlumens, he apparently decided to switch tactics again. He'd finally realized why he couldn't easily provoke her and adapted once more. But adapted for what? What was the point? She couldn't understand it. Hermione placed all the dried dittany leaves inside a large pestle and began grinding them into a powder. Miney? Charlie popped his head into her potion supply closet. Yes? Snape dropped by earlier looking for you. Oh, did he say why? Had a new recipe for you, I think? Gave it to Poppy to heal some new curse he helped invent. Charlie's expression was twisted with anger. Many of the Order members blamed Severus for every curse developed in Voldemort's curse division. They thought that if Severus were really in the Order side, he'd find a way to sabotage the entire thing. Hermione rolled her eyes. If he weren't there, we'd lose dozens more people before we'd figure out the Compter curses. His information is vital for giving me time to prepare. Yeah? And how many of our people do you reckon he's killed getting that information? Those are our people they're experimenting on to make the spells. He's murdering people, but it's all right because he's sending us intelligence on counter curses. Does it really work that way? Hermione stilled from her dittany grinding. He's a spy, Charlie. Those are the kinds of things they have to do to maintain their cover. If he blew it to save a group of prisoners or tried to sabotage the place, Voldemort would create a new one and we'd lose the intelligence. The loss would never pay off in the long run. So you say, Charlie said, his lips thin and his eyes hard. He turned and walked away. Hermione ground the dittany for a few more minutes before funneling into a jar. Severus must have developed a potion for healing the acid curse. She hoped it was different from the one he'd been working on when she stopped by Spinner's End. She had no more acromantula venom. Ministry-issued identification was required to buy from apothecaries. She would have to find a new source from the black market. It would probably cost several hundred galleons. The Order was low on funds. The goblins had taken a neutral position in the war, but while Gringotts remained open to the Order, getting into the bank for money without being arrested was a challenge. Not to mention that being a Muggle-born was an imprisonable offense. Most members of the resistance were unemployable, either by blood or association. It was fortunate that Harry had a very large vault, because they probably would have been starved out of existence otherwise. If the potion required acromantula venom, well, hopefully Severus would be able to give her a few drops. If not, she doubted the Order would budget for her to buy any unless the curse was being used constantly. She crossed her fingers and went to find Poppy. The hospital ward was crowded again. The rescue at the prison had been successful, but many of the prisoners had injuries from torture or were malnourished. There had been a firefight during the escape, and some brutal curses had been used. Those with minor injuries had been sent to some of the other safe houses, but Grimmauld Place kept the most complex and difficult injuries for Hermione and Poppy to care for. Poppy was hovering over Rolanda Hooch's bed. A tiny pinprick's incision in Hooch's trachea kept reappearing and slowly growing despite all their efforts to heal it. Whomever was on duty in the hospital ward had to keep a 2-minute timer running in a constant cycle to monitor it. Any change? Hermione asked, leaning down and examining the injury alongside Poppy. Oh, Hermione, you're back, Poppy said in a sad voice. Severus came and looked at it. He said it isn't one of Voldemort's new ones, so it's likely a miscast curse. Hermione sighed with relief before a sharp wave of guilt struck her. If it was a miscast curse, they were unlikely to encounter it again. But it also meant that they'd likely be unable to heal Rolanda. Hermione had tried without success to deconstruct the injury with spell analysis, trying to unravel it. The structure was so mangled and inconsistent, it was impossible to neutralize. How much longer do you think the healing spells will work? Pomfrey quietly asked, staring sadly at her longtime colleague. Hermione mentally calculated the time that had passed since Madame Hooch had been brought in. It was an obscure piece of knowledge, but eventually healing charms ceased working when used in too great of a frequency. Even magic couldn't force a body to keep repairing itself beyond a certain point. If we keep healing it every 2 minutes, the spells will probably continue working for another 20 hours, Hermione told her gently. Poppy nodded and tucked the blankets gently around Rolanda's body. Severus left a new recipe for you, she told Hermione. He said you should get a flagon ready. Poppy reached into her pocket and withdrew a small roll of parchment and a vial. Hermione lifted the vial up into the light. 2 drops of acromantula venom, probably worth more than 50 galleons. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes. She slipped the vial into her pocket and unfurled the recipe to see what it would require to brew. She had all the ingredients except fluxweed, which she had to harvest under a full moon. She calculated the next lunar cycle. She'd have to wait for a week before she'd have everything she needed to make the batch. If the curse was as serious as Severus had indicated, she would have to hope that there would be no more skirmishes before the full moon, which was likely a delusional notion. At the end of the recipe, Severus had included the counterspell for the acid curse in his spiky handwriting. She reviewed it. It was simple, as he had said it would be. Hermione copied the counter curse onto a fresh sheet of parchment. An injury involving acid would need to be countered immediately. Waiting a few extra seconds to call a healer or to apparate the wounded could add days to the recovery. The counter curse was simple enough. Every resistance member could learn it. She wrote a brief note of explanation, and with a flick of her wand, folded the note into a paper airplane and sent it zooming through the house to find Harry. Would you be able to take your shift early? Poppy said. Hermione looked up and realized Poppy was looking gray with grief. Of course, Hermione said quickly. I want to write Phileas, Pomona, and Minerva. They might want to come and say their goodbyes, Poppy said, shoulders drooping. The notes on what I've done are all in the logbook, and I just released the incision, so you could start a 2-minute count now. Hermione watched Poppy Pomfrey as she walked with slow, heavy steps out of the hospital ward. Hermione went over and glanced over the logbook. There were no surprises in it. She walked quietly from bed to bed. Everyone was still asleep, and a few were dosed with draught of the living dead. It was a method of keeping them alive while certain slow brewing potions were being made to cure them. She ran a precautionary diagnosis on each body and ran through a mental checklist of which position she needed to attend to. She needed to send out the first doses of Wolfsbane potion to all the lycanthropes in the order. It was a quiet day in the hospital ward. Aside from the constant recasting of the healing charm on Madame Hooch, most of the other injuries simply required careful supervision and time. Hermione sat and speculated about what Malfoy might be like during their next meeting. The fact he was also a natural occlumens was problematic, to put it in the mildest of terms. It meant his control ran deep. Trying to find a way in and make him loyal would be nearly impossible if he was able to winnow away and contain any effect she had on him. If she wanted to have any chance of succeeding, she would have to be slow and insidious, to dig herself so deep into his psyche that he couldn't drag or filter her out. Find a way into his heart, the one place that no amount of occlumency could block or sequester. She shivered slightly. She had never felt cruel before. Cold, unfeeling. She'd been called those things and believed they might be true, but cruel was a line she had always considered herself above. But what she was contemplating was possibly one of the cruelest things she could conceive of. She squashed the hesitation. He was the one who demanded her, now and after the war. She was well within her rights to ensure he paid full price for his demands. If he didn't want her, he shouldn't have asked. She steeled herself and summoned a book from her bag. That is the end of chapter 29. that is the end of chapter 29. So for anybody who's in chat, we are reading Manacled. All of the previous episodes, if you do exclamation TGGC, is all on YouTube. We are on chapter 30 of volume 2. But this is a dark romance, lots of trigger warnings. This is not going to be everyone's cup of tea. It's an excellent, excellent book. If you could do exclamation TGGC, that would be amazing, Addie. This is where all of the previous episodes are. So if you're somebody who wants to catch up with all the previous episodes, they are all right there. Thank you so much, Addie. So, Macarino, I do my best. It's hard. All right, let's go. We are going to begin chapter 30. Chapter 30, flashback 5. Chapter 30, flashback 5. April 2002. The following Tuesday, Malfoy behaved much in the way he had the week before. He taught her occlumency, letting her practice the forms. Sorry, my nose is running. Letting her practice the forms and techniques. He didn't make it hurt. He barely even spoke a word to her. He only touched her once to tilt her head further back in order to make eye contact. And then, while he was in her mind, she could feel his hand still resting on her neck, his thumb against her throat. He didn't need to touch her. She knew. He could easily perform legamancy on her from several feet away. He didn't pry, didn't poke his head into memories that she overtly did not want him in. He just let her use his presence as a sort of practice dummy for learning evasive mental maneuvering. When he withdrew, she stared up at him curiously. Where did you learn that? I'm assuming your aunt didn't use this technique. She did not. His teeth bared slightly as he said it. I read about it in a book. Malfoy Manor has a large library. It wouldn't work with most people, only other natural occlumens. Even though anyone can potentially learn occlumency or legamancy to some degree, it's always either painful or so subtle they can barely even feel it happening. He looked at her and added with a smirk, "You could say I'm experimenting on you." Hermione rolled her eyes. Did the book require physical contact too? She said in a sweet tone, eyeing his hands pointedly. She immediately regretted saying it. His hand tensed slightly, just enough to shift from resting to holding. His eyes darkened as his irises expanded incrementally. No, that is just because I can. He smirked as he pulled her forwards and dipped his head to kiss her. It was a cold kiss. His lips pressed against hers weren't wanting or passionate. It was simply a reminder that he could, that he was being restrained, that if he wanted to, he could demand anything he desired from her, and she had already consented to give it to him. Hermione didn't respond to the kiss. She just let his cold lips meet hers without resisting until he pulled away. Do you have any information this week? She asked as he slid his hand off of her and he stepped back. He drew a scroll from his robes and handed it to her. Spell analysis and counter curses information for new curses from the Dark Lord's Curse Development Division, he said. There's a new set being taught currently. Hermione slid the scroll open and glanced over the information listed. Severus had already given the order all the details about the curses, but Malfoy couldn't know that. That it had occurred to him was a sign of how useful and proactive he was able to be. If they lost Severus, Malfoy was able to provide both types of If they lost Severus, Malfoy was able to provide both types of intelligence. An excellent spy. This is invaluable information, she said, packing it carefully into her satchel. He shrugged. No, really, this will save lives. I didn't even think to ask for this. That you did, I don't know how to thank you enough. Malfoy looked vaguely uncomfortable with the gratitude. Whatever, it was an obvious piece of information to provide. The death rate in your resistance is getting noticeable. Hermione felt the blood drain from her face, and he stared at her. How much longer do you think you all can keep fighting? Her throat tightened. As long as it takes, or until there's no one's left. There's no plan B, Malfoy. There's no surrendering for us. He nodded. Good to know. Then he paused, as though abruptly recalling something. Is there a safe house involving a lot of children up in the Cathelness? Hermione blanched. Why? Why would you ask that? His face grew hard. It's been noticed. Someone will likely be sent to investigate by the end of the week. Don't let them find anything. Hermione nodded sharply. I have to go, she said, rushing to the door. She summoned a corporal Patronus through sheer will. They'd become a struggle for her ever since she'd obliviated her parents. It had taken her several years to regain the ability, and they'd never fully regained the silver luminescence they'd had during the 5th year. Fine, Minerva McGonagall, she said. Tell her to prep for evacuation. As her otter scampered away, she cast another. The sleek, translucent creature stood on its hind legs and stared up at her. Go find Kingsley Shacklebolt. Tell him we need a new safe house for the Catholics. Then she apparated away to find Moody. The process of evacuating children was slow and arduous. All of them were unable to apparate themselves, which meant that all available and easily contacted resistance members had to be mobilized to carry them to safety via broomstick, repeated side-along apparation, or on the backs of thestrals. Creating porkies was too time-consuming. None of the safe houses could risk having a flu connection. The remote location had been a strategic choice. The hope was that it would pass unnoticed by Voldemort despite the presence of a great many. Oh my God, guys, I'm so sorry. I'm getting so tongue twisted. The remote location had been a strategic choice. The hope was that it would pass unnoticed by Voldemort despite the presence of a great many odd children in such a small town. In retrospect, it was sheer luck they had succeeded for so long. There were a few good options for trying to rehouse so many children in such range of ages. They had no backup safe houses for so many. The children had to be split up throughout dozens of safe houses, ferrying them in small groups to other parts of the UK, and then resettling them, expanding rooms and transfiguring new beds. Hermione had made 3 trips. After she returned from the last one, she slumped against a wall with exhaustion. She'd apparated several toddlers all the way to Northern Ireland. Then they had vomited and screamed and sobbed with each progressive apparition. She'd been forced to stop and console them until they would hold still enough for her to safely apparate again without splinching anyone. Minerva appeared and stopped in front of Hermione, her expression conflicted. Your information? Minerva asked quietly. Hermione nodded. Moody's going to tell anyone who asks that he learned about it while interrogating a snatcher. Minerva gave a sharp nod of acknowledgement and pressed her lips together, staring at Hermione for several seconds. You're a good girl. I hope that's never doubted by anyone. Are you all right? He hasn't done anything to me. It was all the reassurance Hermione could give. Something untwisted itself in Minerva's expression. She nodded sharply and then swept away to help take down the wards and shrink the furniture. Hermione glanced at the time. It was a full moon that night, and she needed Fluxweed. She stood up and walked out of the maze until she reached the edge of the anti-apparition barriers. Then she began the series of jump backs towards London. She stopped in a large field she often started foraging at the forest of Dean. Goodness. She stopped in a large field she often started foraging at near the forest of Dean. Holding her wand out, she cast a point me charm and followed it in search of the weedly plant. The bright light of the moon cast a sea of grass in sharp shadows. The clustered trees nearby rose up like black curtain against the bright night sky. As Hermione slid down a small slope, a gust of wind shifted across the field, rippling the grass so that it whispered softly. As the sliding, shifting sound faded, a low howl emerged from the trees downwind of Hermione. She froze. A werewolf. There had never been werewolves in this area before. She had been so tired and distracted, she hadn't even thought to take any precautions. Then another howl emerged, further away and to her right, and then another howl. There was a pack of werewolves in the forest of Dean. She almost apparated away, but paused, hesitating. She needed fluxweed. If she didn't get it that night, she wouldn't be able to get any until next month. She had to make the potion. Severus would not offer advice or take the time to invent potions unless they were urgent. She had bolted down the hill in the directions the locator spell was indicating. Another howl. Closer. She whipped the silver knife from her pocket and began slicing sections of fluxweed as fast as she could without affecting the potency. There wasn't enough. She recast the locator spell and ran in the direction her wand sent her. As she did so, she looked up to see the sharp, elongated shadow of a werewolf sauntering down the slope towards her. She skidded and nearly fell as she reached a spot with several fluxweed and then cut them down in seconds. The werewolf was less than 12 feet away and crouching into a lunge when she finally spun on her heel and apparated to the closest place she could think of. Hermione reappeared on the steps of Malfoy's unplottable shack. Gasping for air, she dropped down on the top step and sat panting as she tried to recover her breath. She leaned against the door and closed her eyes as her heart continued pounding violently. She was terribly out of shape. She couldn't believe how quickly she tired out from just running. Her esophagus burned, and there was a sharp, stabbing pain through her lungs every time she breathed in. Aside from tromping through the countryside in search of potion ingredients, Hermione didn't engage in any physically strenuous activities. After she'd been pulled from fighting, she hadn't had time to drill or practice or even worry about her physical endurance. Merlin, she was useless. If she ever found herself on a battlefield again, she'd probably be cut down in seconds. Her breathing had evened, but she remained in place for another minute as she tried to will her heartbeat into slowing. The door behind her abruptly wrenched open, and she toppled backwards into the shack. Her head banged into the wood, and stars flashed before her eyes as she discovered Malfoy staring down at her in rage. "The fuck? Granger, what are you doing here?" "Malfoy?" she said, staring up at him in confusion. "What are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" he snarled. "You activated the wards. I assumed you needed me for something." "Oh," Hermione said, heat staining her cheeks. "I didn't realize the monitor ward extended beyond the room. I didn't mean to bother you." She rolled over and stood up. Malfoy looked her up and down. "What were you doing?" "I needed fluxweed harvested under the full moon," she said, finding that she was still panting slightly. "And there were werewolves. I couldn't wait until next month, so I run away and tried gathering as I went, but I'm not very fit anymore. It winded me. This was the closest place to apparate to, so I was just trying to get my breath back." "What were you getting fluxweed? Where were you getting fluxweed?" His tone had an edge to it. She gestured over her shoulder. "There's a field near here, in the forest of Dean. It's one of the places I usually go to find potion ingredients." "Usually?" There was a pause. "You wandered the countryside at night, foraging?" His expression had become frozen. "Yes." Hermione nodded, eyeing him. "I mentioned this." "No." "You said you were getting potion ingredients. I assumed that you meant you had a supplier." His expression was growing hard, and his eyes were accusing as though she'd lied to him. Hermione stared at him with disbelief. "I'm a terrorist. It costs a small fortune to buy potion ingredients off the black market. I'm not going to waste my budget when I can get it for free and at better quality by doing the work myself." "So you're traipsing around the countryside of magical Britain at night to gather potion ingredients alone?" "Obviously," Hermione said, sniffing. "That's why we meet on Tuesday mornings after I finish." There was a long silence. "You cannot." He announced it in a tone of finality. "You will stop. You will stay inside whatever sad little safe house they keep you healing in, and you will not go foraging again." Hermione stared at him indignantly for several astonished seconds. "I will most certainly not." You don't control what I do. His expression hardened, a predatory glint appearing in his eyes. I do, actually. Have you forgotten? I own you. If I tell you to sit in this room and stare at the wall until next week, you gave your word that you'd do it. Hermione felt rage bloom through her. No, I wouldn't, because you gave your word not to interfere with my work in the order. Foraging is part of my work. It's a non-negotiable. If you want to control everything I do, you'll have to wait until we win. You gave your word too. Malfoy stood glaring at her, his eyes calculating. Then he abruptly changed the subject. So you outran werewolves? She flushed. No, I mean, they weren't very close until the end. I only ran maybe 100 yards at the most. And you're still panting from that? He said skeptically. I don't really do any field work aside from foraging. There's not much of a need to work on my stamina, she said, drawing herself up defensively. Malfoy's mouth suddenly dropped open. He snapped it shut and dropped a hand over his eyes for several seconds, as though he was trying to compose himself. Then he dragged his hand away and stared at her. When exactly was the last time anyone drilled you? I assume you practice basic dueling, given you're so important they won't let you fight anymore? Surely, since they let you go out alone in the middle of the night, your defense must be second to none. Hermione dropped her eyes and fidgeted with the strap of her satchel. I'm very busy. Part of the reason they pulled me from combat is because there are a lot of other things I'm needed for. How long has it been, Granger? His voice was hard. She glanced around the room. The stupid place didn't even have anything she could pretend to be looking at. She focused on a knot on the floorboards. It's probably been 2.5 years, she said quietly. He dropped his face into his hand and was silent, as though he couldn't even bear to look at her. Hermione rolled her eyes. Well, I'll be going then, she said at length in a crisp voice. Sorry I bothered you. It won't happen again. I'm training you, Malfoy said abruptly, straightening and glaring down at her. What? She stared at him in confusion. I'm going to train you, he said slowly. Since getting you to stop is apparently not an option, I won't waste my time dealing with a new contact in the order because you aren't smart enough to stay in fighting condition. Given the way they all fight, I'm sure anyone else I got would be shite at occlumency and likely to eventually be picked up in a skirmish. Malfoy's Slytherin self-preservation instinct was certainly still strong. Hermione sighed with irritation. It's really not necessary. I don't fight. There are rarely any issues when I'm foraging. You needn't worry that you'll be inconvenienced by losing your precious war prize. Really, he said, his voice airy as he stepped toward her. You don't want to? Because you'll be done learning occlumency shortly. I would think you'd prefer to fill your time with dueling practice rather than some of the other activities I could demand you participate in. Hermione glared at him. She doubted he had any intention of following through with his thinly veiled threat, given that he'd shown no particular inclination. If he wanted to teach her dueling, there was no harm in it. She wouldn't be able to succeed in her mission if they weren't spending time with each other. Fine, she snapped, her expression twisting in faint derision. You look so bitter. His expression was vicious with mockery. You think I just demanded you fuck me rather than not? Disappointed? Only in your dreams, she said, shooting him a glare. Every night. She rolled her eyes. Do you buy all your company? She said, her voice sweet and her expression condescending. He didn't even blink. I enjoy professionalism, he said blandly, staring up at the ceiling as though he were reciting a mantra. Clear lines, no drama. I'm not obliged to pretend that I care. He sneered at the last word, as though caring were the most offensive concept known to man. Of course. How very... you. Quite, he agreed with a thin smile. There was a silence. Hermione wanted to tell him he was vile, but she was certain he already knew. She felt tired, and it made her want to be cruel. Do you talk to them and cry, telling them about how sad and lonely your life is, or just bend them over without a word? She asked, her voice lilting with the taunt. His eyes flashed. Want me to show you? His voice was sharp and cold as a splinter of ice. Hermione's near run-in with the werewolves had the adrenaline still spiking through her. She was used to the high stress of the hospital ward, but it was always someone else's life. She felt high on the rush from her near brush with death. She understood Harry suddenly. She felt like she could do anything. A sudden thought came to her at Malfoy's threat. She stared up at him, raising her chin. You won't. His eyes got cruel, but before he could respond, she continued, it would be too real for you. Doing it with someone you know, someone you'd see again, it would mess with those clear lines. Testing me, Granger? Testing me, Granger? His voice was low and caressing. She stared at him. I suppose I am, she said coolly, but her heart was beginning to pound at the realization of what she'd just done. He leaned down, his eyes hard, until his face was centimeters from her own. Strip. Hermione didn't waver, and neither did he, so he stepped slowly closer until she shuffled back. He loomed over her, his eyes glittering. It's killing you, isn't it? Wondering. You expect me to do this to you right off, so waiting, trying to guess when I might get around to it, that bothers you more than the thought of actually having to fuck me. He sneered. Well, you have my attention. Strip. Hermione stared up at him, feeling her face grow hot, even as the rest of her body became increasingly cold. You don't even want me. Why did you include me in your demands? What is the point? She asked. Her voice was angry and confused. He smirked. You're right. I don't want you. It shouldn't have hurt her to hear him say it, but somehow it did, especially set with the vindictive mockery in his expression as he stared down at her. However, owning you is never going to get old, now and after the war. I can't wait to see how bitterly I can make you regret those words. So, strip. His voice dropped low. Or did you want me to do it for you? Hermione's hands went up to the collar of her shirt, and she gripped it defensively. She was terrified and enraged to the point she thought she might start crying. He did own her. She agreed to it. Her jaw trembled, and her hands started shaking. Power gets you off, doesn't it? Her voice shook with rage as she forced herself to unfasten the top button of her shirt. Hurting someone who can't or won't fight back, using what people care about to torture and cage them and force them to do things. You are just the same as Voldemort. The malice in Malfoy's expression abruptly vanished, and he paled. The check on his rage suddenly disappeared, and darkness and magic poured off of him in waves, filling and writhing through the air. The ice-cold fury that appeared in his expression was staggering. His eyes turned black. His lips curled in a snarl, and he kept getting paler and paler as he stared at her. Hermione's eyes widened in terror, and she cringed away, bracing herself. There was a tidal wave of fury rising up around him. Get out, he snapped. She stared at him, unmoving, like an animal petrified by fear. He snarled with rage. Suddenly, the door to the shack slammed open so violently the hinges snapped and it plummeted to the floor. Get out! He roared. Hermione did not need further invitation. She bolted for the door and apparated the second she felt herself clear the wards. When she got through the door at Grimmauld Place, she collapsed onto the floor of the foyer, shaking with terror. Stupid, stupid, stupid. She berated herself, trying to force herself to breathe. She felt like she was having a panic attack. She couldn't understand what had prompted her to try provoking him. If it weren't the middle of the night, she would have banged her head into the floor with frustration over her idiocy. After all the countless times she had scolded Harry, warning him about the consequences of his stupid, thrill-seeking, she might have him beaten. She was an idiot. She pressed her hand over her pounding heart and dropped her face into the crook of her elbow. She whimpered quietly, Draco dorminis nunquam titillatus. Except she hadn't tickled a sleeping dragon. Her actions appeared to have been more in the realm of waltzing up and smacking it upside the head with a beater bat. They needed Malfoy. They desperately needed him. And a bit of adrenaline made her lose her mind? He was right. She couldn't handle the dread, the constant anticipation, exhausting herself wondering about what it was that he wanted, what he intended to do to her, constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. It was eating her alive. If he was going to hurt her or fuck her, she just wanted to know and have him do it. Going to him every week, uncertain of what he might do to her next, it was breaking her into pieces. She bit down on her lip as she huddled against the door. She tried not to burst into tears as her rush of norepinephrine lost its hold on her, and she found herself sharply dropped low. She was awash in horror and despair. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed quietly. Her anxiety had quite possibly just cost the Order the war, or at least countless lives. She had to find a way to fix it. She wrapped her arms around herself and tried to calm down and think. Breathe, breathe, breathe. When her chest finally stopped stuttering, she stood up and brushed away the tears. She made her way up to the potion supply closet. She stored the fluxweed and spent several minutes trying to organize her thoughts and force her hands to stop shaking. She went on to her room. The door was ajar, which was odd, because both she and Ginny were generally fastidious about keeping their doors shut and locked. Grimmauld Place wasn't broadly accessible to the Resistance, but there were occasionally nosy individuals with little respect for privacy or personal possessions. Hermione peeked in and then jumped back in surprise. Ginny and Harry were half naked, and if they weren't already, they appeared mere seconds from shagging. Hermione cast a quick privacy charm on the door and hurried away. On the landing of the steps, she paused and hesitated. Grimmauld rooms were crammed currently. A number of the older children from Cathanas had been brought there. The parlor downstairs was currently occupied by all the insomniacs. There weren't many places left to sleep. She was so tired. Her bout of crying left her feeling internally hollow. She crawled into a window seat and tried to drift off, but her mind wouldn't quiet itself. She kept replaying her conversation with Malfoy, fretting over the potion she needed to brew, reliving the moment all the rage poured off of Malfoy, and he roared at her. But he hadn't hurt her. He'd had every opportunity and more than sufficient fury, but he'd held it back and driven her off instead. A murderous Death Eater with some sort of moral code? An oxymoron if there ever were one. It had to be connected to his motive for aiding the Order. What did he want? It aggravated her deeply that she couldn't figure it out. After tossing about on the window seat for half an hour, she sat up with a sigh. She didn't want to try brewing Severus's potion until she was rested. She clambered up and went to the uppermost floor of the house. There was a practice room there. She looked in and found it empty. She made her way into the middle of the room and, drawing her wand, began making her way through some of the dueling poses. When she'd returned from her healer training throughout Europe, she'd only participated in 2 small skirmishes before the Order decided to pull her permanently from combat. After the years away, she'd gotten rusty, far less proficient in dueling than anyone else in her age group. The rest of the DA were fast and cast powerful spells, dodging and weaving while maintaining an excellent precision even from a distance. Healing was subtle. It was almost always required holding back, close work with attention to tiny details. Trying to duel again was such a reversal in the technique that she'd been awful. Ron and Harry devoted quite a bit of time trying to help her catch up. But before she'd managed to do so, Kingsley advised pulling her entirely from combat. No one made so much as a murmur in disagreement. Hermione understood the rationale, but years later the decision still hurt. She felt as though she'd failed somehow and was being shunted away from everyone else. Shunted off away from everyone else. The original DA had become a tight-knit combat unit that she was just not a member of. Hermione bit her lip and cast a Protego as powerfully as she could. The shield bloomed in front of her. She sighed in relief as she withdrew the spell. At least she could still manage that. Sorry. I turned too many pages, sorry. At least she could still manage that. She cast a series of hexes at the dummies across the room. Half of them hit their targets, none of them precisely. She flashed and tried again. She was somehow worse the second time. Hermione berated herself. She was still standing, not on a battlefield, not while having any spells directed back at her. She was shite. In the unlikely event that Malfoy trained her, he would tear her to pieces for how inept she'd become. She squared her shoulders and tried again. She cast a few more complex curses. Well, she could manage that. It wasn't a lack of proficiency when it came to combat magic. She was simply terrible at the actual combat aspect. There was some consolation. Well, not really. She kept going until she was so tired her hands were shaking from exhaustion. Then she dropped onto one of the training mats and fell asleep. Hermione, bloody hell! Why are you in here? Hermione squinted the next morning and found Ron standing over her, flanked by Ginny, Neville, Dean, Seamus, Lavender, Parvati, Padma, Fred, and Angelina. And she sat up with a groan and rubbed her eyes. My bed got taken in the rehousing shuffle. She lied, shooting Ginny a look. I came here to sleep. Oh, said Ron. Well, we're going to be practicing an attack formation before Neville and Seamus have to head out on a recon mission, so we need the room. Hermione nodded and stood. Can I watch? She found herself asking. Ron furrowed his forehead and stared at her. Sure, I guess. If you have time for it, just keep a shield up. Lots of hexes will be going. Hermione backed into a corner and watched Ron lay out the strategy. She couldn't track all the terms that they used. It wasn't traditional combat terminology, rather a sort of shorthand that had evolved among the fighters over time. Their own language. As they scattered across the room, she cast a shield around herself. Ron activated one of the wards on the room with a charm, and then everyone started casting a series of hexes towards the walls. The spells bounced off and ricocheted back and forth across the room. Soon, the room was full of flying magic. Hermione watched as the DA members began running through their attack formation. Their spells were all precise, their shields powerful. None of them even got nicked by the flying spells. It was instinctive for them. They knew when their shields needed to be renewed. They knew how everyone else fought, who would cover for them. They fought closely and cast non-verbally. Their combat skills were vastly superior to her own. It would take a miracle for her to catch up. She watched them run through the formation twice before she turned and slipped out of the practice room. She went to her potion supply closet, gathered up the ingredients, and got ready to begin brewing. The following Tuesday, she apparated into Whitecroft and approached the location of the shack slowly. She wondered if Malfoy would be there. She prayed that he would. She had no idea how to fix things if he refused to even appear. She could only hope that whatever was causing him to spy was sufficient motivation that her actions wouldn't dissuade him. If he weren't there, she would just wait. If he was there, she hoped he would just punish her and get it over with, rather than force her to continuously dread it. The door had been repaired. She braced herself and pushed it open. Empty. After waiting for a minute, she went over to the chair by the table. Her stomach was twisting itself in dread, and she tried to distract herself by reciting arithmetic formulas while she sat there. She just needed to stop thinking about what might happen next. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack, and she stood and turned sharply as Malfoy appeared. He stood, staring at her, his expression indecipherable. Hermione didn't say anything. She just looked at him. She was relieved. She wasn't trembling. She forced herself to meet his gaze. That needle-like sensation of terror began lacing through her spine. She suddenly felt cold. She could feel the hair on the back of her neck stand on end as she braced herself. She could see his jaw clench, and he glanced away from her. He was apparently not intending to speak first. She took a deep breath. She needed him. He was clearly still furious with her, but she had to fix it, whatever it took. "I'm sorry," she said desperately. "I lost my head and crossed the line. I'm sorry. Whatever I need to do to make it up, I'll do whatever you want. Just let me fix this." That is the end of chapter 30. That is the high turd. That is the end of chapter 30, and we will begin chapter 31. And then that will be the final chapter for tonight. So, chapter 31. Here we go. Right? 29, 30, 31. Yeah, we have to do 31 too. Flashback 6. Chapter 31. Flashback 6. April 2002. Draco looked sharply at her, something she couldn't read flickering across his expression. "It's fine," he said in a hard voice. "When I said I wanted you willing, that meant you were allowed to say no, although perhaps trying to say it instead of purposely provoking me." Hermione stared at him in shock. He clenched his hands into a fist and pressed it against his forehead as though he had a headache. "Do you want to continue with occlumency?" he asked. Hermione shifted slightly but didn't answer. She felt knocked off kilter. The conversation what did he mean? Was it possibly a feint so he could catch her off guard? If she were allowed to say no to things, he certainly hadn't bothered to communicate that to her. In fact, he'd heavily implied the opposite. Although, he hadn't really done much that wasn't primarily to just provoke her. So, she eyed him warily. Something that she said to him that night had accidentally struck a nerve deeply. What had she said? That power got him off, hurting someone who couldn't or wouldn't fight back, using what people cared about to torture and cage them and force them to do things. That he was just the same as Voldemort. That he was just the same as Voldemort. That was probably it. He probably regarded himself as better than his master. Maybe he thought that if he helped the Order overthrow Voldemort, that it would leave a vacuum of power that he could fill. The thought made her insides twist. Was that really it? Was he playing both sides against each other, thinking that he could seize power in the aftermath? Perhaps he objected to Voldemort's reign of terror. The attacks used to frame the Order, and all the torture and experiments. Malfoy probably imagined he'd rule in a genteel manner where women were ostensibly willing and executions were ceremonial. Yet, it seemed like he'd been more than just offended. His rage, the rage he carried, was surely larger than merely ego or ambition. Her wary expression seemed to annoy him. He hissed slightly and his teeth flashed. "Suffice to say, I am not going to hurt you," he ground out. "So stop looking at me as though you expect me to curse you in the back." The words made Hermione flinch. If she weren't so desperate to ensure that he'd keep spying for them, she would have sneered and asked why he hadn't made such an allowance for Dumbledore. He seemed to see the retort in her expression, and his jaw twitched. She bit her tongue and glanced awkwardly around the shack. "I do want to finish learning occlumency." "All right." His tone was clipped, and he appeared to have boxed in his anger. His face smoothed into that cold, indolent mask once more, but his silver eyes continued to study her. She could almost feel his gaze against her skin. He moved toward her. He felt simultaneously the same and yet different, as though he were going through the same motions, but more consciously than he had in the past. There was a subtle element of over precision. He tilted her head back with his fingertips. When she looked deep into his eyes, she could see a bitterness that she didn't think had been there before. He sank painlessly into her mind. It was more of the same for the next 2 weeks. More occlumency and a reserved Malfoy. Conversation remained stilted, although the intelligence he provided continued to flow generously and remained sound. Hermione berated herself internally each week as he apparated away after exchanging less than a dozen words with her. Her psychological sketch of him had stalled. Each week, she added more questions with no answers. The list of potential motives ranged from the magnanimous to the monstrous. She could tell that she was almost done with occlumency training. Malfoy's evasions of her mind were growing agonizingly painful and aggressive as he tested her technique and abilities. She was tempted to ask if he still intended to train her in dueling, but she was afraid to bring up the subject again. She was beginning to feel desperate. When she got back to the shack, she paced nervously, trying to come up with some way of breaking through all this awkwardness. There had to be some way to get through to him, some weakness she could find to get inside. Malfoy appeared in front of her with an abrupt crack and seemed to wince slightly as he straightened. Hermione had seen that subtle expression often enough to identify it immediately, no matter how carefully he concealed. Without even pausing to think, she whipped her wand out and cast a rapid diagnostic on him. Before she could glance down for the results, Malfoy lunged forward, knocking her wand away and had her pinned to the wall. "What are you doing?" he snarled. Right. He probably wasn't in the habit of letting people cast magic in his direction. She met his eye steadily. "You're hurt." He snatched his hands away from her and stepped back. "It's nothing," he said. "I'll have it taken care of later." Hermione's eyes dropped down to the colors and details surrounding her wand, lying on the floor a few feet away, reading the most obvious parts. "You've got several fractured ribs, a concussion, and internal bruising. It will take me 10 minutes to fix," and she gave a pointed look. "Apparating will hurt even more the next time. If you leave the fractures and keep doing it, your ribs may fully break. You could puncture a lung. If there are shards, the ribs would have to be removed and regrown." He stared at her for several moments before rolling his eyes. "Fine." She knelt down and grabbed her wand. "Strip from the waist up." He went still for a moment. "I thought that was my line," he finally said as he reached up stiffly and unfastened his cloak, letting it pool in the careless heap on the floor. "If you wanted me so badly, you need only ask." He leered at her in an overtly fake way. Everyone had methods for handling pain. Harry got very quiet, while Ron would become what Fred and George had termed bitchy. Seamus and Charlie swore in such volume and length that they had to be silenced. Pain clearly made Malfoy even more sarcastic than he already was. At least that meant he was talking to her again. Hermione rolled her eyes. "Yes, nothing gets me going like the sight of an abdomen mottled with purple and green bruising. I always knew you were a sadistic bitch." The comment caught Hermione so off guard, she burst out laughing. Malfoy appeared astonished by the success as he began unbuttoning his shirt and awkwardly trying to shrug it off. He had a shoulder injury, too. She reached out slowly like she were approaching a defensive animal. He didn't flinch away, so she set to pulling his shirt off him gently and taking in the damage. He appeared to have been flung extremely violently into something. His shoulder had been dislocated, but he must have popped it back in place. His entire right side was completely covered in bruises. It was remarkable that his arm wasn't shattered. "What happened?" she inquired with sincere curiosity. "A new pack of werewolves," he answered shortly. "There was leadership issues." "So, what? You fought a werewolf, Alpha? She asked skeptically as she started repairing his ribs. Well, he was strictly forbidden from biting or clawing, and I wasn't allowed to kill him. But when you've got beasts with a pack hierarchy and you try to run them without beating them into submission first, you're just waiting for an insurrection, Malfoy explained as though such things were common knowledge. Is this all from winning or losing? She asked as she repaired the fracture on another rib. He glared at her. Winning, obviously. I wouldn't have been apparating anywhere if I'd lost. Fucking animal didn't even think to use his wand. They go all feral once you start running in packs. He rolled his eyes as he said it and then added, now, I'm ostensibly the alpha of a werewolf pack. Adds to my natural charm, I think. The alpha is sure to try to kill you, Hermione pointed out. Malfoy snorted. He's welcome to try. It will take me less than a minute to take him down once I'm allowed to kill him, he sneered. Hermione didn't reply. With a non-verbal spell, she summoned her satchel and pulled out the emergency kit she always kept with her. Sit down and drink this, she instructed as she handed him a potion. It will deal with the concussion you have. While he was downing it, she rubbed her hands together to warm them and then dipped her fingers into a small jar of paste. She eyed him thoughtfully for a moment before lightly setting her hand on his bare shoulder. He nearly jumped out of his skin. Relax, she said, feeling the muscles in his shoulders grow taut beneath her fingers. It won't sink in well if you're tense. Malfoy didn't relax at all. She rolled her eyes. She drew her fingers lightly over his shoulder, spreading the paste and letting him get used to the contact. The muscles in his shoulders flinched and twinged slightly. It reminded Hermione of petting a skittish horse. Of all the contexts in which she had imagined Malfoy eventually, half naked in her presence, healing him had surprisingly not been one of them. But she could use this to patch things and continue working on her initial strategy. He was absurdly lonely. He seemed unsettled by physical contact that wasn't either violent or sexual. She supposed that wasn't surprising. Who was there to even be kind to him? By his account, his brutal training with Bellatrix had been unimpeded by anyone, even his mother. The thought made her shiver slightly. Crucioing a 16-year-old to teach him occlumency and then leaving him to pass out from it? She could use that emptiness, that loneliness. The need for comfort was written into the human psyche. Malfoy might not even be conscious enough of the absence to be defensive. If she awakened that need, she'd be in. Non-sexual physical contact was something she was comfortable with. Touching bodies, being soothing and comforting. It was, she realized, an unexpected advantage she held over Malfoy. He liked clear lines. She would blur them and then slip through the gaps. She leaned forward just slightly so that her mouth was close to his ear. His skin smelled faintly of salt, along with subtle, biting undertones of oak moss and the sharp, green scent of papyrus. This will hurt a bit, she said softly. Then she began to knead the muscle in order to force the healing paste deep into the tissue and restore the stretched tendons. If she didn't get it to sink in fully, the damage could become permanent, and Malfoy might become prone to getting his shoulder dislocated. Fuck, he groaned. You are a bitch. Her hands stilled for a moment before she resumed. The claim has been made before, she noted quietly. That response seemed to catch Malfoy slightly off guard. He subsided and clenched his jaw while she continued. Within a minute, she was done, but she continued massaging his shoulder, gently, in a way that was, strictly speaking, not medically necessary. After an extra minute, she paused with her hands resting lightly on his shoulder. I need to finish up with your ribs now. It's the easiest if you lie back. He sighed and laid down on the floor. She stuffed his cloak behind his head and shifted herself around so she was sitting beside him. He was staring at her with intense suspicion. She busied herself with her healing kit, and fished out a large vial of serum. After a quick spell to clean the paste off her hands, she poured the viscous liquid into her palm. She spread it across his arm, side, and chest in small circular motions. She took note of where it vanished fastest and added an additional layer of serum. With her free hand, she cast a new diagnostic charm. He had a kidney contusion too. She sighed faintly. You've got a bruised kidney. I don't have the potion for it with me, so you'll have to go see a healer for that. It's not severe, but it'll hurt for a few days if you don't get it taken care of. The bruises on his chest were slowly vanishing beneath her fingers. As they did, the circular motion she was drawing grew gradually slower as she appraised him. He was quite attractive, physically. He must have a genetic propensity towards low body fat because all of the muscles in his torso and arms stood out in stark definition. His whole body was hard and angular, without even a hint of softness. He wasn't a bodybuilder, but he was fit. Most men had to at least a layer of fat cushioning their flesh before meeting muscle. Despite how strong all the Weasley boys were, their muscle definition was generally somewhere faint beneath their skin. Harry had an eternal propensity towards scrawniness, regardless of his physical condition. It wasn't surprising, she supposed. Lucius Malfoy was well built and far from portly, while Narcissa had been thin as a lath. She studied Malfoy thoughtfully. Do you leer at all your patients, or am I special? Malfoy abruptly drawled. She started and blushed. I wasn't, she said defensively. I was just wondering about your body fat ratio. Of course you were, Malfoy said, snorting. She withdrew her hands. You're done, she told him quietly. He sat up and rotated his shoulder as he studied her repair work of his ribs. Then he drew his shirt back on and rebuttoned it quickly. Hermione looked away and began packing up her healing kit. So, how does a person beat a werewolf without killing him? She inquired. A Bombarda Maxima with the wand point against his eyeball seems to do the trick, Malfoy said casually as he picked up his cloak and stood. But you have to let them get that close, which obviously did not go entirely as planned. She stared at him. You blew up his eye? It would have killed a wizard, but werewolves never know when to die. He is most assuredly going to try to kill you, Hermione told him seriously. I'm counting on it, he said savagely. She rolled her eyes and stood up. So, more werewolves? Any other information? He wandlessly conjured a scroll. A few new non-lethal curses your order might deign to use without impugning their precious consciousness. Details on the new prison in Cornwall. Also, the Dark Lord is considering making his name into a taboo. You may want to warn all your foolhardy fighters against throwing it around as a demonstration of their Gryffindor courage. Hermione accepted it, and he turned to go. Thank for the patch job, Granger. He vanished. Hermione glanced around the shack for a moment before slipping the scroll into her satchel. She had healed Draco Malfoy. She had healed loads of people, but somehow healing him felt different. For a few minutes, he hadn't felt like a Death Eater. He had simply been a person who was in pain. A person. She wasn't used to thinking of him in that way. It felt safer to make him impersonal, a concept in her mind. Death Eater, murderer, spy, target, tool. That was how she preferred to categorize him. Not as an injured person. Not someone who winced from fractured ribs. Not someone so unused to physical touch that they flinched away reflexively. Not someone attractive. The interaction had appeared to patch the awkwardness, to bridge the space that had formed. But it had also carved away at the otherness that she had been able to apply to him as her enemy, the murderer of Albus Dumbledore. The perspective that enabled her to think unflinchingly about potentially manipulating him into his grave. Thinking about him as a person made him less of a monster in her mind. She couldn't allow herself to do that. It awakened the Hermione of Hogwarts, the 14-year-old girl who had knitted hats and started a society for the promotion of elvish welfare. The righteous teenager would be horrified by her future self's by how her future self stood, rationalizing the strategic necessity of intellectually dehumanizing Draco Malfoy. That is a mouthful. Hermione's hands shook slightly as she shuffled the thought into the back of her mind. And he had come to her as soon as she'd arrived. Despite his injuries, he'd come. She wondered if that meant something. That's important. And he had come to her as soon as she'd arrived. Despite his injuries, he'd come. She wondered if that meant something. Hermione returned to Grimmauld Place and went immediately up to her room. Before walking in, she peered superstitiously around the door to ensure the room was empty. Harry and Ginny were not together. Ginny had sought Hermione out several weeks before to assure her of that detail. It had simply been a fling in the heat of the moment. There was apparently a lot of heat, given that Hermione had nearly walked in on them a dozen times since. Hermione, along with everyone else in Grimmauld, was feigning ignorance over Harry's dramatically improved mood. He'd bound through the house like a joyous stag. Hermione pulled her notebook from beneath her bed and muttered the counter charms for the security measure she had placed on it. She flipped through the pages carefully, looking over everything she'd written, taking note of how her opinions and theories had evolved and scattered. She nibbled on the tip of her quill as she underlined a comment she made weeks before. Lonely. Isolated. She was growing convinced that it was the central pillar to him. Dead mother, insane father, ambitious friends, all devoted to their self-preservation. Whatever was driving Malfoy to cast himself off from Voldemort and throw in his lot with the Order was probably a secret from everyone. There was no room for honesty and friendship while serving under the rule of a megalomaniac who was the most powerful legamins in the wizarding world. Hermione was almost certain that no one on Voldemort's side knew Malfoy was a spy. He wouldn't possibly risk it. Hermione could be a safe repository for his secrets. If she got him to trust her, if her occlumency was good enough, he'd be able to rationalize it to himself. She turned his strengths into weaknesses she could capitalize on. She poked her head under her bed in search of a psychology book she wanted to reference. As she looked over the books piled, she stilled. They had been removed. The difference was slight, but she was certain. Someone had been snooping under her bed. She cast a detection spell that came back blank. She looked back at her notebook, the cast of series of charms and analytic spells on it, looking for tampering. There were no signs. She stared under the bed again, and then around the room. Creature. The dratted elf rarely did more than sulk and insult people, but occasionally he would go on a half-hearted cleaning spree. The room did appear to have been dusted. Ginny's generally unmade bed had been straightened out somewhat. Hermione relaxed slightly, but she cast several extra spells on her books and a ward that would notify her if anyone were to disturb the books again. She also added a very thorough self-destruction spell on the notebook if it were tampered with by anyone. As she was standing up to leave, Ginny walked in. "You're back early," Ginny said. Hermione glanced down at her watch. She was. Her meetings with Malfoy were regularly exceeding the allotted half hour. It was the first time she returned before 8:30. Normally, Hermione had to rush to store the potion ingredients before her 9:30 shift in the hospital ward. "Lucky day," Hermione said. "Yeah," said Ginny, looking slightly awkward. I wanted to ask you about something." Hermione waited. Ginny tugged nervously at her hair. She'd kept it cut in a bob just past her chin ever since the long ponytail had been grabbed during a battle, and she'd been nearly killed by a hag. Well, you obviously know about me and Harry," Ginny said. Hermione gave a short nod. "Right. Well, the thing is, I want to be careful. I've been using the charm, but there's something about the Pruitts. They're not like other wizarding families. they just get pregnant somehow. Ron and I were both accidents after the twins came along. So I was wondering if you'd make a contraceptive potion. If you have the time. I was always rubbish at potions. If you can't, that's fine. I can ask Padma. I know you're terribly busy. I didn't want to ask you first. Of course. I'll be brewing tonight anyway. It'll be an easy thing to include. Do you have a preference about taste? The most effective ones don't taste very pleasant. I don't care what it tastes like, if it works, Ginny said boldly. Well, I've already got a few vials of one variety. I can give them to you now if you'd like. You do? You do? Ginny blinked and stared at Hermione suspiciously. Are you? Hermione could see Ginny running a list of possible men in Hermione's life. You're not with Snape, are you? Ginny suddenly choked. Hermione gaped. God, no, she said, spluttering and waving her hands as though she were trying to ward something off. I'm a healer. I keep a lot of things on hand. Good grief, why would you even? Ginny looked slightly abashed. He's just the only person you ever seem to talk to for very long. Aside from Fred, who's with Angelina, everyone else you just end up fighting with, and not in that hot, bothered, angsty sex later kind of way. That doesn't mean I'm shagging him, Hermione muttered, feeling as though her face were about to burst into flames. He's a colleague. I consult with him about potions. You just seem lonely, Ginny said, giving Hermione a long look. Hermione started slightly and stared at Ginny. You don't talk to anyone here. You don't talk to anyone anymore, Ginny said. You used to always be with Ron and Harry, but even before you left to become a healer, you seem more and more alone. I thought maybe you had someone. Granted, Snape would be a weird choice for a lot of reasons, but it's a war. It's too much for anyone to handle alone. Cathartic shagging is Ron's thing, not mine, Hermione said stiffly. Besides, it's not like I'm fighting. Ginny looked at her pensively for a moment before saying, I think that the hospital ward is worse than the battlefield. Hermione looked away. She had sometimes wondered if it might be, but it had never been a question she could ask anyone. Ginny continued, I think of it every time I'm in there. In the fields, everything is so focused. Even when someone's injured, you just apparate them away and then you head back. You win some, you lose some, you get hit sometimes, you hit back. You get days to recover if it's bad, or if your dueling partner dies. But in the hospital ward, every battle looks like losing. I'm always more traumatized after being in there than I am by fighting. Hermione was silent. You don't ever get time off, Ginny added. They can never spare you long enough to let you grieve. I know from Harry and Ron that you're still pushing for dark arts when you go to the order meetings. I don't agree, but I get it. I realize that you see the war from a different angle from us. Probably the worst one. So, I'm just saying, if you had someone, I'd be really happy for you. Even if it was Snape. Hermione rolled her eyes. Ugh. You should probably stop talking now if you still want that contraceptive potion, Hermione said with a glare. Ginny snapped her mouth shut. Hermione grabbed her satchel off the bed. Come on, they're in my potion supply closet, Hermione said, walking out of the bedroom. The vials were all stored up on the top shelf in a small box. Hermione pulled out a dozen and put them in a small pouch for Ginny. One a day. It's best if you take at the same time every day. I'll make another batch this week and give you a month's supply. Thanks, Hermione. Ginny slipped away, and Hermione packed the box back up onto the top shelf. She had lied. Contraceptive was not a potion she kept on hand. It had been Hermione's personal supply, which it should be... It had been Hermione's personal supply, which she had been taking as a precaution since the day after Moody approached her about Malfoy. The next week, Malfoy was in the shack when Hermione arrived. When she opened the door, he stared at her with an expression of mild irritation. She looked at him confusedly. Am I late? She asked, glancing at her watch. No, he said, his tone clipped. She closed the door awkwardly and waited. I think we're done with occlumency, he said after a minute. All right. She started to open her mouth to ask if he intended to train her in dueling, but then shut it again and waited. Something about his mood unsettled her slightly. We'll start with the basic dueling so I can see how bad you are at it, he announced. Hermione rolled her eyes. Fine, she said. What are the rules? None for you. Do whatever you want, he said. I'll restrict myself to stinging hexes. I want to see how long you'll last. Hermione blushed. I'll just tell you now, I'm going to be awful, she said. Yes, I'm expecting that. She glared at him, put her satchel on the floor by the door, and placed a protective ward around it. Then she turned to face him. He'd moved across the room and was leaning lazily against the wall. All right. He reached into his robe and withdrew his wand. She cocked her head to the side. That's not your wand from school, is it? She asked. He looked down and spun it in his fingers. No, he admitted. My unicorn hair didn't handle the dark arts very well, so I had to replace it. Still hawthorn wood, but less yielding, with a dragon heartstring core. It's also a few inches longer. Oh my God. He raised his eyebrows suggestively at the last line he said. Hermione filed the information away for future analysis. She thought there was a book on wand theory at Grimmauld Place in the Black Library. She got into dueling position. Malfoy straightened and entered the same position with a flourish. Hermione had been trying to practice dueling whenever she could find the time to sneak into the practice room. She shot a nonverbal stunner at him, and he deflected it easily with a shield as she shot a series of stinging hexes at her. She cast her own shield rapidly and kept it in place with a Fianto Duri spell. Malfoy cast an endless stream of hexes and carelessly knocked away the spell she sent toward him without even moving. Despite the low impact of the spell he was using, the rapidity with which he cast hexes was wearing Hermione's shield down. Before she could recast her shield, he shot a low hex at her feet. She yelped slightly as she was struck on the ankle. It went rapidly downhill from there. She jumped backward without a thinking and left herself open. He admittedly struck her with an additional 5 hexes. All right, she shouted. You've won. Stop it. That's not how it works, Granger, he drawled while continuing to non-verbally shoot hexes at her. In the battlefield, you win or you die, or you run away. Hermione physically dodged his spells and finally managed to recast her shield. She was standing gingerly on one foot. Her side, where he'd repeatedly struck her, was swelling and inflamed. She angrily shot a slightly dark curse at him. Not anything deadly, but more serious than a stunner. Malfoy deflected it and quirked a brow. The kitten has claws, he said with a mock wonder. Oh, stuff it, she snarled as she cast a series of nonverbal spells in his direction. Good God, Granger, your aim is atrocious, he told her while still machine gunning her with stinging hexes. I'm not even moving, and you're missing me. I'm aware. No wonder they pulled you from combat. Shut up! Struck a nerve, have I? He said dryly. His gray eyes were glinting, and she realized that he was punishing her for something. Whatever had been irritating him when she'd arrived, he was getting back at it for her. Passive-aggressive wanker. He wasn't even trying. He already knew she was rubbish. He was just doing it for his own personal amusement. She spun away from his hexes and cast her shield again. She was already getting tired from the combination of dodging and casting. She gripped her wand tighter and kept going until he struck her wand hand with so many hexes she couldn't even hold it anymore. Her wand fell to the ground. Rather than try to dodge, she just stood there as he struck her on the torso, the legs, with a dozen more hexes. Then he finally stopped and stared at her. Feel better now? She inquired. He smirked and put his wand away. I've wanted to hex you for years, he said with a satisfied gleam in his eyes. I already told you you could, she said in a wooden voice as she began mentally cataloging everywhere on her body she'd been struck. But I suppose you like to pretend you're giving a sporting chance. It's not my fault you're so pathetic at defense. No, that's on me, she said quietly, lifting her hand and wincing slightly as she tried to move her fingers. The stinging hex was non-permanent in its damage, but it also couldn't be reversed magically. With the quantity and concentration Malfoy had used, it would take her more than a day before the pain from all the welts faded. She was certain he'd chosen the hex specifically because of that. For the record, she said, trying to keep her voice from shaking, this qualifies as interfering with my work, so perhaps use a reversible hex or keep it all on one location next time. Malfoy said nothing. So, she asked after a minute, do I get to know why? When it comes to cursing you, Granger, your mere existence is reason enough. She pressed her lips together and swallowed hard. An aching sensation spread across her nose and cheeks, and she blinked away. Did you have any information this week? No. All right, well, I'll be going then, she said, kneeling stiffly and picking up her wand with her left hand. Then she went over and pulled her satchel onto her shoulder, flinching slightly when the strap landed on several of the welts. Malfoy didn't say a word as she walked out. She stood outside the shack, feeling at a loss, not at Malfoy's cruelty, but over what she was supposed to do. She couldn't go back to Grimmauld Place and have someone realize she'd been hexed. She'd have no explanation for it. She walked gingerly over to the stump and stood on the edge of it. With a sigh, she pulled her satchel off her shoulder and began pulling sacks and bottles out. She'd have to throw away all the potion supplies she'd foraged. They required careful storage in order to maintain their magical efficacy. She wouldn't be able to perform the necessary spell work with her wand hand in its current condition. She sadly dumped the Murtlap tentacles onto the ground. She would have to snare and kill another one. And the fairy wings. Then she dumped out all the rest until she had nothing but a bundle of stinging nettles left. With a grimace, she snatched them up and pressed them against both her ankles, and all over both hands and wrists. Then she lightly brushed her face with a bundle as well. She dropped the nettles onto the ground and watched as the multitude of tiny welts blistered up across her skin and obscured all the hexes her clothes couldn't conceal. With a sigh, she stood up, holding her wand lightly. She apparated back to Grimmauld Place. Hermione, what happened to you? Angelina inquired wide-eyed as she walked through the door. I tripped and fell into a nettle patch, Hermione lied. Oh, golly. Angelina stared at Hermione's face until she began to blush faintly. Anything you could do about it? Unfortunately not. There aren't any spells for nettle stings. They should fade in a day, but I couldn't forage very well, so I'm going to have to go again tomorrow. Too bad. Your poor face. Hermione shrugged mildly. My hands are worse. I have to go to tell Pomfrey. I'm not sure how good I'll be at the hospital ward today. Because of Malfoy's hexes, Hermione found herself unexpectedly with a free day. Not that she was able to enjoy it much without being able to use her hands. She couldn't even bend her fingers enough to grasp and turn a page in a book. She couldn't remember the last time she'd taken time off. Any time she got time away from healing, she used it to brew some of the more complex potions or restock her potion supply. She sat and stared at the window in the attic, watching the passing muggles. She wondered what it was that provoked Malfoy. She wondered if perhaps getting hexed by him might actually be a good sign, that it meant she was getting to him, and so he was lashing out defensively. Healing him the week before had been a shift in their interaction. He'd probably seen hexing her as a way to put her back in her place. He was so vindictive. Occlumency training had hurt far more, but it had been constructive. There had been a point to the pain. There had been potions to deal with the migraines. Hexing her had just been his nastiness. It was a rubbish way to appraise her fighting abilities, because once he'd hit her with the hex, she wouldn't be able to start over for another week. If he'd wanted to test her aim or endurance, he could have just repeatedly immobilized or petrified or stunned her. He hadn't used any serious or permanent hexes, presumably because it brushed against that moral code he was so conceited about, his ethical line. He didn't like to think of himself as a sadistic or vindictive. He probably told himself that he was giving her a sporting chance, that she deserved it each time she got hit because she should have dodged the spells. He didn't want to think of himself as cruel. He probably thought he was better than that. Hermione stared down at her hands. On the grand scale of pain and cruelty, stinging hexes barely registered. Yet emotionally, she found the experience had devastated her more than she was prepared to admit. She pressed her eyes into the crook of her arm as she tried not to cry, but the tears slipped out anyway. That's a rough spot to end. I'm sorry. Oh my God. That's a really rough spot to end. Goodness gracious. All right. That was the end of chapter 31. And you won't find out why until chapter 32. So, all right, we're in the aftercare section. I feel like these chapters are also, yeah, it's a retinol hex. I feel like these chapters are obviously a lot longer, so I feel like there are a lot more to sort of like keep up with. If you have questions, I totally get it. Like, I feel like there's a lot more that happens in each of these chapters, and you just get so much backstory. I almost choked on some popcorn. Converse, honestly, let me tell you something. This is, I feel like these, did you actually almost choke, or are you saying that like you were laughing? I will say that there's a lot going on. How do you guys feel? What are your thoughts thus far? Do you have anything you want to add? Any questions, concerns, comments? Do you have any inclinations of what might be going on still, because you have no idea yet? What are your thoughts? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Especially as this is the first flashback that we already heard, the Ginny flashback in volume 1. This is the first time we're seeing it in context. So yes, thank you, Andy. That was interesting, revisiting the memory with Ginny and us getting more info. Exactly. So the contracept, that's exactly, I think this is the first of many flashbacks that we're gonna put 2 and 2 together, that the contraceptives were actually hers, because she thought she was going to be getting down with Draco, so she was like, all right, and that they are actually for Ginny and Harry. I'm just going to be finally moving forward with the juice flash. But yes, I'm going to stop making predictions about what I think will happen, because I think I'm psychic. Elle? Well, I was up and about, so I'm having, oh no, don't worry. It will be on YouTube, Darius. You know, every episode. I knew Draco was going to be a good guy. Elle, it's an interesting thing. You know, I think, would I categorize Draco? Oh, no, I can't say anything. I can't say anything yet. No, I can't say anything yet. Oh my God, I can't say anything yet. But Draco, you know, these characters, I will say this, even in the OG series, you know, these characters are super complex and they have a multitude of layers. And I think that this Manacled just does this even more. It makes it just makes the characters even more fleshed out and more complex. I'm just curious. I'm gonna go, how do you feel about Hermione's plan? As we delve through these flashbacks, what are your thoughts about Hermione's plan and how she's, and how she is thinking about how to handle this relationship with Draco? He's making me change my mind all the time. It's, well, Elle, and you haven't, I'm telling you, baby, if you are, okay, you know when you're getting into a pool, you know when, like, there's a stair and your feet are, like, getting acclimated to the temperature, but it's only, like, you're really, like, the top of your foot? That's how deep we are into this so far. Like, we're not even in the shallow water yet. We aren't even in the pool yet. We're just dipping our toes in the top, getting acclimated. My confirmation bias is too strong. I don't know if I can see Draco's anything other than bad. Andy, you're gonna be my favorite reaction at the end. I'm genuinely curious how you will feel at the end. I really am, because it's so wonderful. It's amazing. I can't wait. But I do, what's your theory, Converse? But I really want to know, what are your thoughts on Hermione? Because we're now seeing that Hermione has a plan and she doesn't know how she's enacting it yet, but you see her doing very emotionally manipulative things intentionally. What are your thoughts on that? I'm just curious, because it's the first time we're seeing Hermione, when in volume 1, Hermione has no teeth. You know, she's sort of fighting back in any way she can. She's doing the things she can, but she's so broken. She's so fragile, and her character has been so beaten down. This is the first time we're seeing Hermione trying to play tennis with Draco in a way where they're a little bit more even. And she's concocting her own plan. And they're kind of like, they keep doing these like standoffs with each other where they're staring at each other and they're trying to assess each other. Any initial thoughts about that so far? I'm just curious, because it's the first time we're really seeing Hermione with some teeth. Even she herself says it's the cruelest thing she's ever done. I'm just curious what you guys think. I can't say anything. I mean, Addie, it is very hard to not say anything. All fair in love and war. She's up against a cold-blooded murderer. Being emotionally manipulated seems like the least she could do. Okay. Okay, I think that's valid. I think that is valid. I think that is very valid. And I think I think Andy's reaction at the end of the book will be my favorite. I can't wait. I also think I'm really excited that you guys are getting to see Hermione, like, I also like that they're a little bit funny. Like, I like Hermione's a little sassy. I like how Draco's a little bit, you know, I like that there's having, like, repartee, and there's, like, a little bit of, like, you know, I think the first volume, Hermione, you know, she really has been declawed. Like, he makes a joke, oh, the kitten has claws, but, like, she really was. In the first book, she's so traumatized, and rightfully so. It's just nice to, it's so nice to get back to watching her continuously get stronger, because we're just at the beginning of her, you know, strength. But it's a very, very interesting story. So if you have no other things you want to add to this episode will be on YouTube for the Good Girls Club. All previous episodes will be on the Good Girls Club. This episode I'm going to export right after, so hopefully it will be up by like 6 a.m. or something. And then this week we read chapters 29, 30, and 31. Next week we will read chapters 32, 33, and 34. And just, you know, these chapters are just longer than, Volume 2 is just in general longer than Volume 1, and each chapter seems a little bit longer, so the episodes are going to be a little bit longer. But converse is theory. My theory is, don't know if this has been said before, but because Hermione doesn't have all of her memories, you just said this is a beautiful story, so I think she doesn't remember that they're in love. Converse, okay. Very, very, very interesting story. I mean, listen, miles to go before we sleep. Let's see where we end up. Let's see how love plays into this. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening to this episode of the Good Girls Club. I love you guys. I will see you next week in the Smut Hut for another episode of the Good Girls Club. Thank you for listening. Thank you for enjoying the story. I love all of your guts, and I'll see you guys on the other side of the Smut Hut, baby.